The sound of their laughter was as thin and sharp as the recycled air in the jet bridge connecting the terminal to Stellara Air Flight 815. It coiled around Dr. Annelise Dubois, a serpent of casual cruelty. They thought she was just another tired mother, her tongue thick with a Haitian accent they found amusingly provincial. They saw her son's hand in hers, her simple dress, and judged her entire world. What the flight crew with their polished shoes and practiced smiles couldn't see was the steel beneath her skin. They had no idea that their mockery wasn't just unprofessional. It was a critical error. For Annelise wasn't just a passenger. She was a hunter, and she had just found her prey at 30,000 feet. The hum of Houston's George Bush Intercontinental Airport was a familiar symphony of chaos to Annelise Dubois. It was a soundscape of rolling luggage, frantic last calls, and the excited babble of 100 different languages. To her, it was the sound of beginnings and endings, of hellos and goodbyes. Today, for her and her 10-year-old son, Leo, it was a beginning. They were flying to Baltimore to visit her sister, a simple family trip that was for Annelise a rare and cherished respite from a demanding career. Annelise adjusted the strap of her tote bag, her knuckles brushing against the hard edge of the encrypted federal laptop tucked inside. To the world, she was a mother, in a simple but elegant navy blue linen dress, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her face, often set in a look of intense concentration at work, was softened by the gentle smile she reserved for Leo, whose eyes were wide with the thrill of an impending flight. "Mom, do you think we'll see the clouds from the top?" he asked, his voice a high-pitched note in the airport's bassy rumble. Annelise squeezed his hand, her reply carrying the melodic French-inflected cadence of her Haitian upbringing. "Of course, mon chéri. We will be above them like kings in a castle in the sky." It was this accent, a beautiful tapestry woven from the threads of her heritage, that first drew the unwanted attention. As they approached the gate for Stellara Air Flight 815, the gate agent, a woman with a name tag that read Cynthia, offered a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Boarding pass and ID, please," she said, her tone clipped and impatient. Annelise handed them over. Cynthia's eyes flickered from the passport, which read Dr. Annelise Dubois, to Annelise's face, and a flicker of something confusion, or perhaps disdain, crossed her features. "Dubois," she pronounced it crudely, "Dubois." "It is Dubois," Annelise corrected gently, a lifetime of such corrections making the words automatic. "Like the French." Cynthia simply grunted, stamping the boarding pass with unnecessary force. "Zone 4, you'll board after the premium passengers." She turned away before Annelise could even offer a thank you, already gesturing for the next person in line. It was a small slight, a tiny paper cut in the fabric of the day, but Annelise felt it. She filed it away, a habit ingrained by years of navigating a world that often judged the book by its accented cover. The real performance began on the jet bridge. As they shuffled along, caught between a boisterous family and a businessman barking into his phone, they passed two of the flight attendants waiting at the aircraft door. The lead was a man named Brent. He was tall, with impeccably coiffed blonde hair, and a smile that seemed both blindingly white and utterly devoid of warmth. His younger colleague, a brunette named Tiffany, looked at him with an admiration that bordered on worship. As Annelise and Leo passed, Leo stumbled slightly, and Annelise steadied him with a quick, "Careful now, my love. The floor is a little bumpy." The words imbued with her accent hung in the air for a moment. After they had passed, and were a few feet down the aisle, Brent leaned over to Tiffany, his voice a stage whisper designed to be overheard. Did you catch that Z-floor? He's a leetle bombpy? He mimicked his imitation, a grotesque caricature. Tiffany giggled a high, nervous sound. Oh, Brent, you're terrible, she said, but she leaned in for more, a willing audience. Annelise's spine stiffened. She felt Leo tense beside her. He had heard it too. She glanced down, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder, and gave him a small, secret smile, as if they were sharing a joke. But inside, a cold, familiar knot tightened in her stomach. She had hoped for Leo's sake that this trip would be free of such casual ugliness. They found their seats 22A and 22B nestled by the window just behind the wing. As Annelise helped Leo with his seatbelt, she scanned the cabin. Her eyes weren't those of a tourist. They were the eyes of a predator, instinctively cataloging her surroundings. She noticed the slight fraying on the edge of the seat pocket in front of her. She noted the way a panel on the overhead bin didn't sit quite flush. Minor things. Trivial things. But her entire career was built on the principle that disasters are born from an accumulation of trivial things. Annelise was not just a doctor of aerospace engineering. She was a senior safety inspector for the Federal Aviation Administration, a ghost in the machine. Her specialty was undercover audits, posing as a regular passenger to observe airline operations in their natural, unvarnished state. Airlines would get a notification of an upcoming audit period, but they never knew which flight, which route, or who would be watching. Annelise was one of the FAA's best a woman, whose unassuming appearance and quiet demeanor masked a mind as sharp as a scalpel and an encyclopedic knowledge of federal aviation regulations. This trip was supposed to be personal. She was officially on leave. But the instincts of an inspector are not so easily shed. They are a part of you, a lens through which you see the world. And through that lens, Stellara Air was already beginning to look flawed. The rest of the boarding process was a parade of Brent's performative charm. He greeted passengers in the premium cabins with booming bonhomie, calling them by name and offering pre-departure beverages. For those in economy, his smile was a fixed plastic thing. When a passenger struggled to lift a heavy bag into the overhead bin, Brent watched with an air of detached amusement before Tiffany reluctantly stepped in to assist. He made his way down the aisle, his eyes sweeping over the passengers. When he reached row 22, his gaze lingered on Annelise for a fraction of a second too long. A smirk played on his lips. He leaned down, his voice dripping with condescension. "Everything okay back here? Need me to translate the safety card for you?" The insult was so blatant, so dripping with malice that the passengers in the surrounding rows shifted uncomfortably. Annelise felt a hot flash of anger, but she quenched it with a will of iron. Showing her hand now would be premature. She was, for all intents and purposes, a civilian, a mother, a target. She would play the part. She looked up at him, her expression one of polite confusion. "No, thank you. I believe I can manage. The pictures are quite clear." Her calm, measured response seemed to disappoint him. He had been hoping for a reaction, tears, anger, something to fuel his sense of superiority. Denied his satisfaction, he simply sniffed and continued down the aisle. "If you say so," he tossed over his shoulder. Leo looked up at his mother, his brow furrowed with a child's pure sense of justice. "Mom, why was he so mean?" Annelise finished buckling his seatbelt and then took his face in her hands. She looked directly into his eyes, her own gaze steady and firm. "Because some people, Leo, have very small souls. They think making others feel small will make them feel big. It does not work. It only shows everyone how empty they are inside." She tucked a blanket around him and handed him his tablet. The anger was still there, a simmering coal in her chest, but it was now overlaid with something else: resolve. This flight was no longer just a personal trip. The casual cruelty of the flight crew was a symptom, and Annelise knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that where there was this kind of attitudinal sickness, a deeper, more dangerous pathology was likely to be found. The mask of the tired mother remained, but behind it, Inspector Dubois was now officially on the clock. The sky beckoned a vast blue expanse, where she suspected much more than just the clouds would be revealed. The ascent of Flight 815 was smooth, a powerful, reassuring climb into the vast emptiness above the clouds. Below Houston shrank to a geometric pattern of lights and concrete eventually disappearing beneath a thick white blanket. Leo pressed his face to the window, mesmerized by the sight of the sunlit cloud sea. For a while, the magic of flight superseded the ugliness of the boarding. Annelise watched him, a genuine warmth spreading through her chest, momentarily pushing the cold knot of anger aside. This was why she worked so hard. This boy with his insatiable curiosity and his fierce, loving heart was her world. She endured the condescending glances, the mocking tones, and the systemic prejudices for him to build a world where his worth would never be questioned based on the color of his skin or the accent on his tongue. The "Fasten Seatbelt" sign pinged off, and the cabin stirred to life. The flight attendants began their preparations for the beverage service. From her vantage point in row 22, Annelise had a clear, if partial, view into the rear galley, where Brent and Tiffany were setting up their cart. The curtain to the galley was not fully drawn, a minor breach of protocol that allowed snippets of their conversation to drift into the cabin. Annelise, feigning a light doze, tilted her head just so her ears tuning into their frequency. "Can't believe they let just anyone on a plane these days," Brent's voice complained, low and venomous. "And with that kid, probably paid for the ticket with government cheese." Tiffany's response was a nervous titter. "Brent, stop. Someone will hear you." "Who cares?" he shot back. "It's the truth. Did you see her dress? Probably from a discount bin. And then she has the nerve to correct my pronunciation." "It's Dubois," he said again, stretching the vowel into an obscene nasal whine. This time Tiffany's laugh was louder, more confident. She was feeding off his energy, the weaker animal in the pack, joining the hunt. "I know." And she was like, "The pictures are quite clear. I almost died." Their laughter echoed in the small space, a cruel counterpoint to the steady drone of the engines. Annelise's eyes remained closed, her breathing even a perfect imitation of sleep. But behind the facade, her mind was a whirlwind. Every word was a confirmation. Their behavior wasn't a momentary lapse, it was a pattern. It was a culture of contempt, fostered and led by Brent. She needed more. Mockery was a character flaw, but it wasn't in itself a federal offense. Annelise was looking for the link, the place where their personal arrogance metastasized into professional negligence. Her opportunity came 20 minutes later. The beverage cart had made its way down the aisle and was now parked just a few rows ahead of her. Annelise unbuckled her seatbelt. "I'm just going to the restroom, sweetie," she whispered to Leo, who was now engrossed in a movie. She stood and stretched, making her way toward the back of the plane. Her path took her directly past the galley. As she approached, she saw Brent leaning against the counter, scrolling through his phone. Tiffany was restocking a drawer. The service cart was left unattended in the aisle, its wheels not properly locked. A clear violation of Section 121.576 of the Federal Aviation Regulations, which dictates that carts must be secured during service to prevent them from becoming dangerous projectiles in case of unexpected turbulence. Annelise continued to the restroom. On her way back, she paused at the galley entrance, feigning a need to stretch her legs. "Excuse me," she said, her voice polite and soft. Could I trouble you for a glass of water, please? Brent looked up from his phone, his expression one of pure annoyance. He gestured vaguely at the cabin. We'll be coming through with a water service in about an hour. I understand, Annelise said, maintaining her placid demeanor. But my throat is very dry. I would be most grateful. With a dramatic, put-upon sigh, Brent pushed himself off the counter. He grabbed a plastic cup and filled it from the dispenser with a flick of his wrist, splashing some water on the counter. He thrust it at her without a word. As she took it, Annelise allowed her gaze to sweep across the galley. What she saw made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. A galley latch on one of the upper compartments designed to hold heavy catering containers was not fully engaged. It was resting on the catch, but not clicked securely into place. It was the kind of detail a rushed or complacent crew member might miss. In calm air, it meant nothing. In a sudden downdraft, that container could become a 50-pound missile. She also noted the crew's emergency procedure checklist, a laminated card that was supposed to be clipped in a visible designated spot, was instead tucked under a stack of napkins, half covered by a gossip magazine. These were not minor infractions. This was gross negligence. This was the link. The same arrogance that allowed them to mock a passenger's accent was the same arrogance that led them to believe that safety checks were optional, that procedures were for lesser mortals. "Thank you so much," Annelise said, her voice betraying none of her inner turmoil. She gave him a small nod and returned to her seat. She sat down, her heart pounding a steady, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She took a sip of water, the cool liquid doing nothing to quench the fire in her gut. She looked out the window at the serene, endless blue, but she no longer saw its beauty. She saw a potential catastrophe incubated in a culture of disrespect and allowed to fester through sheer carelessness. The captain, a man named Alistair Finch, had made a brief, crackly announcement after takeoff. His voice was that of a classic airline pilot, deep calm and utterly confident. Annelise wondered about him. Was he aware of the culture of contempt he presided over? Did he enforce standards? Or did he, like so many veteran pilots, remain aloof in his cockpit kingdom, trusting a crew that was dangerously unworthy of that trust? Her undercover identity felt like a heavy cloak. She wanted to stand up, to march to the front of the plane, and to announce herself. She wanted to see the blood drain from Brent's smug face. She wanted to ground this plane and this crew before their negligence could hurt someone. But that was not the protocol. The purpose of a ghost audit was to observe and report, to see the system in its unvarnished, everyday state. Intervention was a last resort, reserved for situations of clear and present danger. The question that now plagued Annelise, as she sat silently in row 22, was a terrifying one. Was that moment of clear and present danger about to arrive? The unsecured latch, the unlocked cart, the casual disregard for the rules, they were all pieces of a puzzle. Annelise prayed that the final piece, the one that would turn negligence into tragedy, would not fall into place on her watch. But her gut, honed by years of investigating the anatomy of disaster, told her that the flight of Stellara 815 was far from over. The real turbulence was yet to come. For the next hour, the flight continued with a deceptive tranquility. The beverage service was completed, trays were collected, and the cabin lights were dimmed. Most passengers settled in, lulled by the drone of the engines and the rhythmic passage of time. Leo had fallen asleep, his head resting on her arm, his breathing soft and even. Annelise, however, was anything but calm. She was a coiled spring, every sense on high alert. Her gaze kept flicking toward the rear galley, her mind replaying the litany of violations she had witnessed. The air outside was clear, the ride as smooth as glass. It was the kind of perfect flying weather that breeds complacency. Annelise knew that danger rarely announced itself. It struck from a clear sky. It started with a subtle, almost imperceptible shudder. It wasn't the familiar jostle of light chop. It was a deeper, more violent tremor that seemed to come from the very bones of the aircraft. A few passengers stirred, their sleepy tranquility disturbed. Then came the drop. It was sickeningly sudden. The plane plunged downwards, as if swatted from the sky by an invisible hand. Annelise's stomach leaped into her throat. Loose items, books, tablets, plastic cups were lifted into the air, suspended for a horrifying moment in zero gravity before crashing back down. A collective gasp followed by a series of screams filled the cabin. Annelise's training kicked in instantly. Her arm shot out, holding Leo securely in his seat. Her eyes weren't filled with the panic of a passenger. They were wide with the analytical terror of an expert who knew exactly what was happening. They had hit a pocket of severe, unforecasted clear air turbulence. The plane bucked and yawed violently. From the rear galley came a sound that cut through the screams, a loud metallic clang, followed by the crash of shattering plastic and a sharp yelp of pain from Tiffany. The unsecured service cart, its wheels unlocked, had become a battering ram. It careened across the galley, slamming into the opposite counter. But that was not the worst of it. Annelise knew with chilling certainty what the other sound had been. The unsecured latch. The heavy catering container filled with dozens of soda cans and liquor bottles had been launched from its compartment. It flew across the galley, striking the main control panel for the galley's power and water systems before crashing to the floor. Sparks erupted from the damaged panel. A wisp of acrid smoke began to curl into the cabin. The chaos in the passenger cabin was immediate. People were shouting, a baby was wailing, and the acrid smell of an electrical short began to spread. Brent stumbled out of the galley, his face pale, his mask of smug superiority shattered. "Everyone stay in your seats. It's just a little turbulence," he stammered, his voice thin and reedy. He was followed by Tiffany, who was clutching her arm, her face streaked with tears and a dark bruise already forming. "There's a fire!" she shrieked, her training completely deserting her in a wave of panic. Her words were a match to gasoline. The murmur of fear in the cabin began to escalate into a full-blown panic. A man in the row ahead of Annelise unbuckled his seatbelt, trying to stand up. "We have to get out of here," he yelled. This was it. The point of no return. The moment where observation had to become intervention. Annelise Dubois, the mother, vanished. In her place stood FAA Inspector Dubois, senior grade. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, her movements fluid and deliberate in the still shaking aircraft. She turned to face the panicked cabin, and her voice, no longer soft, rang out with an authority that cut through the noise like a thunderclap. "Sit down now." The sheer unexpected power in her voice stunned everyone, including Brent, into silence. Every eye in the cabin turned to her. She pointed a finger at the man who was standing. "You, in your seat. Buckle your belt. Panicking will get us all killed." The man, shocked by her commanding presence, fumbled his way back into his seat. Annelise then turned her attention to the flight attendants. Her eyes cold and hard, as diamonds locked onto Brent. "You," she snapped. "Your colleague is injured and inciting panic. Get her into a jump seat and keep her quiet. Then report to the flight deck and inform the captain we have a Class C electrical fire in the aft galley." Brent stared at her, his mouth agape. "Who the hell do you think you are?" He sputtered a last gasp of his shattered arrogance. This was the moment. Annelise took 2 steps forward into the aisle, her small frame seeming to fill the entire space. She reached into her simple tote bag past Leo's blanket and her paperback novel, and retrieved a small leather wallet. She flipped it open. I am Dr. Annelise Dubois, she stated, her voice clear and ringing, her accent no longer a point of mockery, but a mark of undeniable authority. Senior Air Safety Inspector for the Federal Aviation Administration Badge, number 7224. This flight is now under my direct authority as the ranking federal officer on board. You failed to secure your galley equipment as per Regulation 121.576. You failed to secure a catering container leading to the impact and subsequent electrical fire, a violation of hazardous material handling protocols. You left your emergency checklist under a magazine. Now are you going to follow my direct, lawful order, or do you want me to add insubordination in a critical incident to the list of federal charges you will be facing when we land? The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the hum of the engines and the faint, fizzing crackle from the galley. The transformation was so complete, so staggering, that no one could speak. The quiet, accented woman from row 22 had become the most powerful person on the plane. Brent's face went from pale to ghostly white. The color drained from it, as if a plug had been pulled. He looked from her unyielding eyes to the gold FAA badge, and his entire body seemed to shrink. The smirk, the arrogance, the casual cruelty, it all evaporated, replaced by a raw, primal fear. Tiffany, despite her pain, looked at Annelise with an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. The woman they had ridiculed, the woman whose accent they had so viciously mimicked, was not just their superior. She was the arbiter of their entire professional existence. Annelise didn't wait for Brent to move. She was already in action. You, she said, pointing to a calm-looking passenger in an aisle seat. I need your help. Are you willing to assist? The man nodded dumbly. Good. There's a fire extinguisher under that seat. Get it. She then turned back to the galley, grabbing the half-full coffee pot. The smoke was thickening. Without hesitation, she strode toward the sparking panel. The moment of revelation was over. The work of saving Flight 815 had just begun. With the authority of a seasoned commander, Annelise took control of the crisis. The passengers moments before on the verge of a riot were now cowed into a stunned, obedient silence. They watched as this unassuming woman who had been the subject of the crew's scorn moved with a purpose and precision that was both terrifying and deeply reassuring. The extinguisher, she commanded, and the passenger who had retrieved it handed it over. Annelise assessed the sparking panel. It was a Class C fire electrical. Using water would be a catastrophic mistake, spreading the current. But the initial sparks had ignited a small piece of paper debris, a napkin that had been near the unsecured checklist. She discharged a short, controlled burst from the extinguisher at the base of the small flame, putting it out instantly. The acrid smoke still hung in the air, but the immediate threat of a larger fire was neutralized. The panel itself continued to spark and fizz erratically. "Brent!" she barked. Not even looking at him. Her focus was absolute. "Did you report to the flight deck?" From his stupor, Brent finally jolted into action, his movements clumsy with fear. Yes, ma'am. On my way." He practically scrambled toward the cockpit, his swagger replaced by a terrified shuffle. Annelise turned to Tiffany, who was still huddled in a jump seat nursing her arm. Annelise's voice softened fractionally, but lost none of its command. "Flight attendant, what is your name?" Tiffany, she stammered. "Tiffany, your arm, is it broken?" I don't know. It hurts." "You need to focus. We have 186 souls on this aircraft. Your panic is a liability." "Breathe," Annelise ordered. "I need you to confirm for me that the captain has initiated emergency procedures. Is the fasten seatbelt sign illuminated and flashing? Tiffany looked up, her eyes wide. The sign was indeed flashing something she had completely failed to register. She nodded mutely. "Good," Annelise said. "Stay here. Talk to the passengers. Reassure them. Tell them the situation is under control. Can you do that?" Finding a sliver of her training, Tiffany nodded again this time, with a hint of resolve. She was terrified of this woman, but she was also in awe. Moments later, the cockpit door opened, and Captain Alistair Finch emerged. He was a man in his late 50s, with a weathered face, and the unmistakable aura of a man who had been in command for decades. His eyes, however, held a look of profound disbelief and fury. He had clearly been briefed by a babbling, incoherent Brent. He strode down the aisle, his gaze fixed on Annelise. "What in God's name is going on here?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "Who are you, and what are you doing in my galley?" Annelise met his gaze without flinching. "Captain Finch, I am FAA Inspector Dubois. Your crew's negligence has resulted in a critical incident. The aft galley has sustained damage to the electrical panel due to an unsecured projectile. I have contained the initial fire, but the panel is still active and poses a significant threat." Finch's face hardened. He was not used to being challenged on his own aircraft. "Inspector, I have received no notification of an audit on this flight." "That's the point of a ghost audit, Captain," Annelise replied, coolly, holding up her badge once more. "To see things as they really are. And what I have seen is a flight crew that is more concerned with mocking passengers than with adhering to basic safety protocols." The barb hit its mark. Finch glanced at Brent, who was cowering by the cockpit door, and then at Tiffany, whose bruised arm and tear-streaked face told their own story. The pieces were clicking into place, and the picture they formed was an ugly one. "My crew is professional," he started to bluster, but Annelise cut him off. "Your crew captain left a 200-pound service cart unlocked in the aisle during flight. They left a catering stowage latch unsecured. Their emergency checklist was buried under a magazine. Their lack of professionalism is precisely why we are in this situation. Now, have you cut power to the aft galley circuit?" Finch was momentarily speechless. Her rapid-fire, accurate assessment of the situation was irrefutable. His authority was crumbling in the face of her superior knowledge and position. "The co-pilot is handling it," he finally managed to say, his tone clipped. "Good," Annelise said. "Then I suggest you return to the flight deck, declare an emergency with air traffic control, and find us the nearest suitable airport for an immediate landing. I want a full emergency response team on the tarmac. Fire medical and FAA ground representatives." She had not asked. She had commanded. She was no longer just an inspector. She was the de facto mission commander for the remainder of the flight. Captain Finch stood there for a long moment, the muscles in his jaw working. The humiliation was palpable. In front of his passengers, in front of his crew, he was being dressed down by a woman he would have dismissed as inconsequential an hour ago. But he was also a pilot with thousands of hours of experience, and he knew a lost cause when he saw one. He knew she was right. Without another word, he turned and marched back to the cockpit, the door clicking shut behind him with a grim finality. The rest of the flight was the longest 45 minutes of everyone's lives. The intercom crackled to life, and Captain Finch's voice, now strained and stripped of its earlier confidence, announced that they would be diverting to Raleigh-Durham International Airport due to a minor electrical issue. Annelise didn't return to her seat. She stood watch by the galley, a silent, imposing guardian. She had a brief, quiet word with Leo, reassuring him that everything was fine and that she was just helping the crew. He looked at her not with fear, but with a new kind of awe understanding on some level, that his mother was someone extraordinary. Brent and Tiffany moved about the cabin like automatons, their faces blank with shock following Annelise's directions to the letter. They prepared the cabin for an emergency landing, their movements wooden, their voices trembling as they shouted the required commands. The mockery was gone. The laughter was a distant, sour memory. All that remained was the cold, hard reality of their failure. As the plane began its final descent, the flashing lights of emergency vehicles could be seen swarming the designated runway below. The landing was firm, but safe. As the aircraft slowed, guided by a procession of fire trucks and ambulances, a heavy silence fell over the cabin. When the plane came to a complete stop, Captain Finch's voice came over the intercom one last time, flat and defeated. "Please remain seated." Annelise saw them through the window first. Two black sedans pulling up near the jet bridge, their official government plates unmistakable. The ground team had arrived. The jet bridge connected with a dull thud. The main cabin door hissed open, but it was not a gate agent who stood there. It was a stern-faced man in a suit flanked by two airport security officers. He made eye contact with Annelise. "Inspector Dubois?" he asked. "Yes," she confirmed. "Robert Maxwell, FAA Regional Office. The field is secure." "We're ready." Annelise nodded. She turned to the cabin, her gaze sweeping over the passengers, then landing on the crew. She addressed Brent Tiffany and pointed toward the still-closed cockpit door. "Captain Finch and his first officer. You three will remain on this aircraft. You will not disembark. You will not contact anyone. You will surrender your crew IDs and passports to Mr. Maxwell. Your careers with Stellara Air are over. Your futures in commercial aviation are now a matter for federal investigation." Her words were delivered without malice, without triumph. They were simple statements of fact, as cold and hard as the fuselage of the plane. Then she walked back to row 22, where Leo was waiting. She took his hand, her role as inspector, dissolving back into that of a mother. "Come, mon chéri," she said softly, her accent returning no longer a source of ridicule, but a badge of her true, unshakable identity. "Let's go. Our trip is over for today." As she and Leo walked off the plane, the first passengers to disembark, she didn't look back. She didn't need to see the looks of utter devastation on the faces of Brent Tiffany and Captain Finch. She didn't need to hear the start of the official inquiry. She had done her job. The karma, as swift and severe as the turbulence that had triggered it, had begun to land. The fallout from Flight 815 was not a quiet, internal affair. It was a bombshell that sent shockwaves through Stellara Air and the wider aviation industry. Dr. Annelise Dubois's report, submitted within hours of landing in Raleigh, was a masterwork of meticulous detail and damning evidence. It was clinical precise and left no room for ambiguity. It detailed the mockery and the culture of contempt, not as the primary offense, but as a crucial diagnostic indicator of the deep-seated professional rot that followed. Brent's world collapsed with breathtaking speed. He was fired before Annelise had even finished her preliminary debrief with the regional office. His dismissal was for gross misconduct and endangerment of passengers. But the FAA's investigation went further. They revoked his flight attendant certification permanently, citing a willful and reckless disregard for safety regulations. The name Brent Alden became toxic in the industry. His applications to other major carriers were rejected instantly. Even budget airlines wouldn't touch him. The arrogant, preening flight attendant who saw himself as a sky god was grounded, stripped of his wings and his identity. His social media, once a curated gallery of exotic layovers and glamorous selfies, went dark. 6 months later, a former colleague spotted him. He was working at a high-end coffee shop in a suburban mall, his once impeccable uniform replaced with a stained brown apron. The condescending smirk was gone, replaced by the harried, tired look of someone taking complex orders for oat milk lattes. When the former colleague approached, Brent didn't make eye contact. He just mumbled the total, his voice devoid of its former theatricality. The karma for Brent was not a dramatic confrontation, but a quiet, humiliating descent into the very kind of service industry anonymity he had so despised. Tiffany's path was different, though no less difficult. She too was fired immediately and had her certification suspended. During the FAA interviews, however, she broke down completely. Through sobs of shame and remorse, she confessed everything the culture Brent fostered, her own willing participation in the mockery and the pervasive cutting of corners that had become standard practice on their routes. She expressed profound shame for her treatment of Annelise. Following the hearing, she did something unexpected. She managed to get a contact address for the FAA's DC headquarters through a lawyer. She wrote a long, handwritten letter to Annelise Dubois. It was not an excuse, but a full-throated apology. Your strength and professionalism in the face of our disgusting behavior will stay with me forever, she wrote. You were protecting your son and 180 other people, while we were acting like cruel children. There is no excuse for my actions, only a promise that I will spend the rest of my life trying to be a better person. Annelise read the letter, her expression unreadable. She did not reply. Tiffany's fate was out of her hands. After a 2-year suspension and mandatory retraining and sensitivity courses, Tiffany was allowed to reapply for her certification on a probationary basis. She eventually found a job with a small regional carrier flying short-haul routes in the Midwest. She was quiet, diligent, and unfailingly kind to every passenger. The scar of Flight 815 was a permanent part of her, a humbling reminder of the price of casual cruelty. Captain Alistair Finch believed his seniority and spotless record would shield him. He was wrong. Annelise's report was the key that unlocked a hidden history of negligence. The investigation into the Flight 815 incident triggered a full-scale audit of Stellara Air's Houston-based operations, and specifically Captain Finch's records. What they found was damning. Investigators armed with a federal mandate pored over maintenance logs and flight records. They discovered a pattern. Finch had a habit of signing off on pre-flight checks that were pencil-whipped, not actually performed. He frequently flew with known minor maintenance issues that should have grounded the plane, bullying junior maintenance staff into signing off on them to maintain his on-time departure record. He had created a command culture where his authority was absolute, and questioning him was career suicide. The contemptuous behavior of his cabin crew was a direct reflection of the arrogant negligence in his cockpit. The FAA threw the book at him. They didn't just suspend his license, they revoked his airline transport pilot certificate for life. The official reason was a long-term pattern of safety violations and falsification of flight records. Stellara Air, in a desperate act of damage control, fired him and publicly condemned his actions. But his fall wasn't just professional. Stellara's insurance carrier, facing millions in potential liability from the Flight 8115 incident, launched a civil suit against Finch to recoup their costs, arguing his willful misconduct had violated the terms of their policy. His pension was frozen. His reputation, once sterling, was now radioactive. He became a pariah in the tight-knit community of veteran pilots. He sold his large home in a wealthy Houston suburb and moved into a small, nondescript apartment. The once mighty Sky King was grounded, his kingdom turned to dust by his own hubris. For the airline, the nightmare was just beginning. The audit of Flight 815 was the tip of the iceberg. The FAA expanded its investigation into a fleet-wide safety and procedural review of Stellara Air. What they uncovered was a systemic corporate culture of prioritizing profits and on-time performance over robust safety standards. Inspectors found dozens of aircraft with deferred maintenance issues similar to Finch's. They found evidence of inadequate training for flight crews, particularly in crew resource management, the very skill that should have prevented Brent's behavior from going unchecked. The headlines were brutal. FAA slams Stellara Air for culture of negligence after mid-air incident. Whistleblowers emerge citing pressure to cut corners at Stellara. Stock plummets as airline grounds 15% of fleet for emergency inspections. The financial cost was staggering. The FAA levied one of the largest fines in its history against the airline, a penalty of $24.5 million. The cost of grounding and repairing their aircraft ran into the tens of millions more. Their stock price cratered, wiping out over $1 billion in market value. Bookings evaporated as passengers spooked by the relentless negative press flocked to other carriers. The CEO, a man named Richard Thorne, who had championed the efficiency over everything model, was forced to resign in disgrace. He was called before a congressional subcommittee on aviation safety, where he was grilled for hours about the events leading up to Flight 815. Tense C-SPAN footage showed him stammering and deflecting, unable to answer for the systemic failures that began with 2 flight attendants laughing at a woman's accent. The karma had hit back not just on the individuals, but on the entire corporate entity that enabled them. The hard, cold truth was that the laughter in the jet bridge wasn't just laughter. It was the sound of a company rotting from the inside out. It was the audible symptom of a disease of arrogance, and Dr. Annelise Dubois had been the one to finally and devastatingly diagnose it. 2 years passed, a period during which the name Stellara Air transformed from a brand into a cautionary tale, a multi-syllable word for corporate hubris. The airline survived, but as a shadow of its former self, its wings clipped by massive fines and a brutally enforced restructuring plan. It was now a humbled entity, obsessively compliant, its new corporate identity forged in the fire of the Flight 815 incident. The ghost of Annelise Dubois's report haunted every training manual and every pre-flight briefing. In the grand marbled atrium of the Department of Transportation headquarters in Washington, D.C., light streamed through the towering windows, illuminating the dust motes, dancing in the air like tiny silent spectators. On a stage before an audience of industry leaders, government officials, and seasoned aviators, Dr. Annelise Dubois stood the weight of the prestigious Wright Brothers Master Pilot Award, cool and heavy in her hands. It was an honor typically reserved for pilots with decades of flawless flying, but the committee had made a special exception. Her award was for her unparalleled contributions to aviation safety, a testament to the fact that the most important piloting often happens before the plane ever leaves the ground. Her son Leo, now a lanky 12-year-old, looking sharp and slightly uncomfortable in a new suit, sat in the front row. His gaze was fixed on his mother, his youthful face a mixture of awe and profound pride. He remembered the woman on the plane, her voice like a thunderclap. Now seeing her on this stage, lauded by powerful people, he was beginning to understand the true dimensions of her strength. When she spoke, the hall fell utterly silent. Her voice, still carrying the warm, melodic cadence of her Haitian heritage, filled the space with an easy authority. It was the same accent that Brent had so cruelly mimicked, but here in this bastion of power and policy, it commanded nothing but rapt attention. "Thank you," she began, her eyes sweeping across the room. "Safety is not an abstract concept. It is not a checklist to be ticked or a regulation to be memorized. It is a culture, a living, breathing thing that must be nurtured in an environment of absolute, uncompromising respect. It begins with the simple act of seeing the humanity in one another." She paused, letting the words settle. "A crew that respects its passengers is a crew that respects its duties. A mechanic who feels respected by their superiors is a mechanic who will double-check a difficult repair. A pilot who respects their first officer will listen when they voice a concern. Disrespect, arrogance, contempt. These are not mere character flaws. In our world, they are pathogens. They are the invisible cracks in the fuselage, the unseen fraying of the wire. They create an environment where negligence can take root and grow sometimes with catastrophic consequences. She spoke not of karma or revenge, but of consequence and responsibility. She concluded, "Our work is a sacred trust given to us by every single person who steps onto an aircraft. Our duty is to be worthy of that trust. It is to ensure that the only echoes in the sky are the sounds of safe passage, not the ghosts of what might have been." As the auditorium erupted in a standing ovation, Annelise's eyes found Leo's. She gave him a small, private smile, and he beamed back his pride uncontainable. This was her true victory. Not the downfall of her detractors, but the example she was setting for her son. Miles away, in a cramped, dimly lit apartment on the outskirts of Houston that smelled of stale air and regret, Alistair Finch sat in a worn armchair. The walls were a museum of his former life, framed photos of him smiling from the cockpit of a 747 plaques for Pilot of the Year, a glass case holding models of the aircraft he once commanded. They were relics from a fallen kingdom. The phone rang, and he flinched. He knew the number. It was a debt collector. "Mr. Finch," a clipped, impersonal voice said, "We're calling about the outstanding judgment against you." Alistair listened, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrest. He saw himself in the reflection of the dark television screen, a gray, diminished man. The rage that had sustained him for the first year had curdled into a bitter sludge of self-pity and resentment. It was their fault, he told himself. The arrogant flight attendant, the hysterical girl, and most of all her, the woman with the accent, the ghost who had appeared and dismantled his entire world. He still couldn't fully grasp that his own actions, his pattern of cutting corners and fostering a culture of untouchable authority, had laid the foundation for his own ruin. He slammed the phone down, the angry beep of the disconnected line, the only sound in the room. His echo was not of safe passage, but of denial. The purgatory of the others was less dramatic, but just as profound. In a bustling mall north of Dallas, Brent Alden wiped down a sticky counter, his movements mechanical. "Excuse me," a customer snapped, waving an empty cup. "My iced vanilla latte was supposed to have oat milk. This is whole milk. I'm lactose intolerant." Brent's jaw tightened. The old Brent would have withered the man with a sarcastic remark. The new Brent just forced a smile that felt like cracking plaster. "My sincerest apologies, sir. Let me remake that for you immediately." As he turned away, the customer muttered to his friend, "Can't even get a coffee right." The humiliation was a constant low-grade fever, a daily reminder of his fall from a self-appointed god to an anonymous servant. Meanwhile, in a call center in Omaha, Tiffany handled her 50th call of the day. An elderly man with a thick Polish accent was struggling to understand his bill. She was patient, speaking slowly, repeating herself without a hint of frustration. "It's okay, Mr. Novak," she said kindly. "We'll go through it line by line together. Take all the time you need." She had requested to be on the line that handled international customers. It was her quiet act of penance, an attempt to repay a debt of kindness that could never truly be settled. Later that evening, Annelise and Leo sat across from each other in a quiet Italian restaurant, the medal from the ceremony resting on the table between them. "Were you scared, Mom?" Leo asked, his voice low. "On the plane that day." Annelise put down her fork. She looked at her son, seeing the young man he was becoming. "Yes," she admitted, her voice soft. "I was terrified, not of the turbulence, not of the fire. I was scared for you. That is a mother's fear, and it is the most powerful thing in the world." She reached across the table and took his hand. "But my training, my work, that is stronger than fear. It has to be. I did what I had to do, mon chéri, what anyone in my position should have done." She thought of the news alert she'd dismissed earlier about Finch, the thought of Brent serving coffee, of Tiffany finding her quiet redemption. Their fates were not a source of triumph. They were data points, case studies in the unyielding physics of cause and effect. Her victory wasn't their failure. Her victory was sitting right in front of her in the intelligent, compassionate eyes of her son. It was in the quiet integrity of a life built on principle, not position. It was knowing she was building a legacy for him, a world where his worth would be defined by his character, a world she fought every day to keep safe, high above the clouds. The story of Dr. Annelise Dubois is a powerful reminder that looks can be deceiving and that prejudice often blinds us to the truth. The flight crew of Stellara 815 saw a woman with an accent and chose mockery over respect. They never imagined that their target was the very person tasked with upholding the safety standards they were so carelessly ignoring. Their casual cruelty was not just a personal failing, it was a symptom of a deep professional rot that led to their downfall and the near collapse of their airline. This is a story about how integrity, professionalism, and quiet strength can triumph over arrogance and contempt. It proves that karma isn't a mystical force. It's the logical, often harsh consequence of our own actions. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramatic stories where justice is served. Thank you for listening.